The thing about exercise is that it's extremely good for you, but the weight loss is benefits are marginal. From a scientific mathematical standpoint, it's actually very, very obvious what needs to be done. You need to change the hormones, not the number of calories.
For somebody who has maybe been trying a lot of different diets over the years, maybe even had some success in short bursts here and there, but they're feeling stuck. Their weight's just not coming off. They're saying, this might just be the way I am. What would you say to them?
Uh it's a tough one because a lot of us feel that way actually. And the thing is that it wasn't always like that. If you look at sort of the population in the 1970s, for example, there was just a lot less. And I don't think it's because people have less willpower or anything like that. It was just that there was a number of sort of fundamental differences in the way we eat, in the way we approach eating, and so on. And therefore, we have to get back to it. So if you don't acknowledge that, if you simply say, oh, it's all about calories and it's all about willpower and all about this stuff, you sort of miss a lot of the nuances of the way that we eat, the way we think about eating, that led us to a lot of success. And that's why I sort of emphasize a lot of stuff about, understanding what causes weight gain. Because we think it's as simple as calories in, calories out, but it's actually much, much more complicated than that. And that's sort of what leads you to understanding sort of how foods interact. So I'll give you an example, for example. So for the last 30 years, we talk about, calories, calories, calories. That's practically the only thing you hear about in terms of, the scientific and the expert opinions. It's all about calories. With the idea that 100 calories of cookies is as fattening as 100 calories of broccoli. And it's actually a ridiculous statement because the minute you put the calories of cookies in your mouth, your body reacts to those cookies much, much differently than if you're to put the broccoli in your mouth. And we can measure those differences very easily. So insulin goes, up in one case, it doesn't in the other one. With broccoli, you might activate stretch receptors in the stomach. So you have different signals in your body, and those different signals in your body are going to make a difference because that's what tells your body whether you use those calories and store them as fat or whether you simply burn those calories as energy. So your body can do different things with the same amount of calories. So we keep pretending it's all about the amount of calories is the only thing that's important. And we sort of simplify it down to the point that it actually is nonsensical. And that's where people go wrong because they say, well, if it's all about calories, well, I'll just eat ice cream for dinner and I should be fine. But you're not fine because the hormonal response to those calories is so poor in terms of trying to lose weight that you just don't lose weight because all those calories go into fat, for example, directly. And you don't have any calories for energy. So understanding that sort of what causes weight gain, the hormonal responses to food, the hormonal responses to the importance of the hormones to body fat percentage is sort of key because we're sort of combating a lot of this ingrained attitudes about calories that was largely incorrect and scientifically completely way off. Like it doesn't make any sense. All these people say it's all about calories, all about calories. It's like it's actually not. There's actually so many different pathways that we've worked out over the last 5 decades.
Well, I want to stick on this train of thought for quite some time and get into the nuances here. And starting with, let's talk about the history here, because this is what people are talking about when you go see your doctor and you're looking to lose weight or even a dietitian. This is the common knowledge that people are spreading and trying on for size. Why is this the knowledge that is being taught in schools then passed down?
Yeah, it gets back to the sort of 1970s, the dietary guidelines. So we'll start with calories. And I do cover this in some of my lectures on YouTube and stuff. One of them is called The Obesity Epidemic Explained, which sort of goes a little bit into this. But let's start with the calories. The whole idea is that your body doesn't just take the number of calories, subtract the number of calories, a certain set number of calories, and then dump the rest in fat. That's not how the human body works. The human body works on hormones. That is, there are hormones that tell us to gain body fat, and there's hormones that tell us to lose body fat. Okay, and there's hormones that tell us to be hungry, and there's hormones that tell us to be full and stop eating, for example. So when you take a certain number of calories of food, you're not only getting the energy contained within that food, that is the calories, you're getting the information of what to do with those calories. So, on in if you take 100 calories, your body has sort of two choices. It can store it as fat or it can burn it for energy, right? And which one it does is different than the total number of calories. It's a totally different, is a totally different problem. So, if you look at the hormones, for example, like insulin, insulin is a hormone that is very important in metabolism, and it basically tells your body to store body fat. It's not a bad thing. That's just its job. Like, you need a hormone to tell you to store body fat, and insulin is one of those hormones. So when you eat, insulin goes up, you store body fat. You store some of that calories as energy, right? Body fat is one of the ways, sugar is another one of the ways that it stores energy, calories. When your insulin starts to fall, then that is the signal that you need to pull some of that stored calories back out. So it's a cycle, right? So when you eat, your insulin goes up, you store body fat. When you don't eat, insulin goes down, you pull out body fat. And it's as long as you keep those two in balance, you don't gain body fat. And you have to have this, otherwise you die in your sleep every single night, or you need to keep eating constantly because you have no source of energy. So you store it away. It's no different than getting food at the supermarket and you put it in the fridge, so you don't have to go to the supermarket for every single meal. It's the same idea, right? It's not that complicated. But the point is that if you have certain foods, especially highly processed carbohydrates are probably the biggest problem. If you have certain foods that tell you that spike insulin way up, like cookies, for example, it's going to spike your insulin way up. Well, now you get from that food, 100 calories of cookies, you get the energy, the 100 calories, but you also get the instructions, which is insulin goes way up. You take that 100 calories, and your body is going to shove that directly into your body fat stores. Why? Because you told it to. If you take 100 calories of broccoli, you get that same 100 calories of energy, but you don't get that instructions to immediately shove that into body fat. So your body is going to process it, get the minerals out, get the vitamins out, and then use it as for energy, right? So there's two different situations for that same 100 calories. If you take that 100 calories of the cookies and it's immediately stored, you have no energy. So why did we believe this? Well, we always knew this, right? The only, the practical implication of this is simply that some foods are more fattening than other foods. Cookies are more fattening than broccoli. That's the only implication, which is pure common sense. However, in the 1970s, we went to a low-fat diet, right? So you have to understand that there was this huge epidemic of heart disease. In the 50s, 40s, and 50s, people were dying of heart attacks, and nobody knew why. So the if you look back, of course, it's pretty obvious why it was. If you look at the rate of tobacco smoke, it was way up in the 40s and 50s. So it had been going up constantly since the 1900s, sort of peaked in the 50s. In the 50s, people were getting their heart attacks because people were smoking. But remember, the tobacco company was busy telling people that tobacco didn't cause any heart problems, didn't cause lung cancer, didn't cause heart attacks. So very few people believed that smoking was the problem. But of course, there was a very strong correlation between the rise in smoking and then 20 years later, the rise in heart attacks, as opposed to dietary fat, which of course was completely flat through that entire time. People didn't change their diet particularly in North America. So they were eating roughly the same as they ever ate, But when they went around and looked for why are we getting so many heart attacks, somebody said it's the dietary fat. It didn't make any sense because if you're eating the same percentage of fat in 1900 as you did in 1950, same, why would you have more heart attacks? Because you haven't changed the amount of fat that you're eating. So it didn't make any sense. But nevertheless, it sort of gained a lot of traction. So the problem with that, of course, is that if you eat a lot, if you try and reduce your dietary fat to very low levels, which was what happened in the 70s and 80s, you have to cut something else. So you can cut the things such as proteins, but proteins you need, or you wind up eating a lot more carbohydrates. So we wound up eating a lot more carbohydrates, and we weren't eating more broccoli. We were eating more white bread and stuff because it was a lot cheaper to buy that. So we switched over to this sort of high carbohydrate and mostly highly refined carbohydrates and low fat diet. And then we started to see a ton of obesity, and people started to say, why? Why are we getting this obesity? The obvious reason, of course, is that you've changed your diet. You went to processed foods and highly refined carbohydrates. But they didn't want to say that because they're saying, you couldn't be good and bad at the same time, right? A high carb diet can't be good in that it reduces heart disease, and bad because it causes obesity, right? Because we know obesity and heart disease are linked. So then the blame went from sort of, well, we should eat less starchy foods, less sugary foods, to, well, it's all about the calories, right? So what they said was, of course, fat is more denser in calories, 9 calories per gram versus carbohydrates and proteins, and therefore you have a lot, it's all about calories. And that's sort of where it started. We had to sort of shoehorn how eating a low fat diet was good for you, both in terms of the heart as well as, we had to sort of fit that in. And the calories model sort of made everything sort of fit together nicely, even though it was completely wrong. Like there was no reason to think that 100 calories is equal in any way, right? And then that's how you got this, all these things like a calorie is a calorie and stuff like that, right? And it's like, well, we never said a calorie wasn't a calorie. What we're saying is that calories are not equally fattening, right? Calories from cookies are more fattening than calories from broccoli, because the broccoli is going to set off all these other hormonal effects, like filling you up and filling up your stomach and all this sort of stuff that's going to keep you slim. So that's where that whole calories obsession was. It stemmed from this sort of low fat. Of course, the whole idea of eating super low fat has been completely thrown out the window in the last little bit. Of course, it just hasn't panned out at all, right? So in the 80s and 90s, we went super low fat, didn't really have any impact on heart disease. Then, of course, we figured out that, hey, nuts were pretty good for you. Olive oil, fatty fish, omega 3s, all that kind of stuff was actually quite healthy. So then you had this whole healthy fat, and then now there's this whole, now they've even, stuff like butter and stuff. It's just not that considered that bad from a heart standpoint. So that's where the sort of obsession with calories came from. It came from this sort of misguided notion of fat must be, we said fat is bad. So we said fat must be bad for everything, and therefore it's not about the hormones that are causing body fat gain. It's actually the calories, even though it makes no physiologic sense whatsoever.
Well, what's so mind blowing about this is the fact that there is so much good science out there showing that this calories in, calories out model is broken. And we're in an obesity epidemic right now. Like things just aren't working. So I'm just confused why it takes, a nephrologist to and there's good reason you found your way to fasting and what we're going to get into solutions to these weight gain problems and obesity. But like, why does the information take so long to get to dietitians, to get to doctors, so people can start getting better?
I think it's because when you have a certain paradigm, which is calories, it's all about the number of calories. calories, right? So what the people are saying, and this is called carbohydrate insulin model, is that it's not just about number of calories, right? It's about the hormonal response to those calories, because our body runs on hormones. So the hormones that you set off with the foods that you eat make a difference to what your body does. So it's sort of a it's not it's both number and also hormonal response. Whereas the prevailing sort of paradigm is sort of, it's purely about the numbers, and they're so adamant about it, right? A calorie is a calorie, a calorie is a calorie. It was like a mantra, right? So you had the entire world saying that calories are calories, so and therefore what they did was they transformed weight gain and weight loss from this sort of, hey, what are we doing wrong in terms of our diet, to it's all your fault because you didn't get your calories strictly enough, or you didn't exercise enough. And it was very convenient for all the academics and stuff to simply blame the people, right? So remember that if you have a population which is gaining a lot of weight, like North America, right? The obesity percentage of obese people just went skyrocketed up, right? So it's going to be one of two things. It's either going to be the advice that was given is bad, or the people. The advice is good and the people are bad, right? So if you're the one giving the advice, right? So the academics, the universities, all these researchers, what do you think you're going to choose? That the advice is bad or the people are bad? So of course they just double down on, my advice is good. The people are stupid. The people have no willpower. Like, the people are the same people. People are people. They're just the same as the 70s. We're not better or worse than anybody else. The lack of it's not a lack of willpower that's driving the obesity epidemic. It's the choices we made because if you have bad information, bad advice, and you make a bad choice, and you say, I can eat cookies because it's only 50 calories, and I'll just eat a little less broccoli. And these were the choices that people were making. Like, I can just eat a little less broccoli and eat a cookie. Hey, that sounds pretty good. And it's perfectly scientifically flat. Like, I'm going to be the same. It's like, no, you're not going to be the same, right? So if you believed the carbohydrate insulin model, then you'd say, no, you can't substitute 50 calories of broccoli for 50 calories of cookies. You're going to be much worse off. But the calories people said, yeah, you could. So people did that, of course. They're like, yeah, I won't eat my vegetables and I'll have that brownie. Hey, I'm all good. But they weren't good, right? Because it was never true. It wasn't just the number of calories. It was two things. And of course, that's why it took so long, because nobody wanted to say that their advice was bad. And you can come up with an analogy. Like, for example, suppose you have a classroom and you have one child who fails, right? That might be the child's fault. But what if you have 70 children who fail? Is it that the child's fault, or is it the teacher's fault? Right? So now we have a situation in the United States where you have 70% of adults being obese or overweight. Are you going to say it's the people's fault or the teacher's fault? Right? Because I think it's much more likely that it's the dietary advice that we've been giving. And I would tend not to blame the people. I would blame the advice that was given, the research that's being given out, what's being taught. And it's not the dietitian's fault. The dietitians go according to whatever the sort of leading science says, right? Because science is largely made up, right? They made up that it's a calorie, right? And they just perpetuated that. But that's sort of where it comes from, and that's why it takes so long. I mean, in science, look at the low fat thing, right? So we switched from butter to margarine for, I don't know, 20 years, right? Through the 70s, remember Basal and all this stuff. You should not eat butter because of the saturated fat and eat margarine instead. So there's this huge shift away for about 20 years from butter to margarine. Turns out the margarine had all this trans fats that were actually causing heart disease, and the butter actually wasn't that bad for you. So that took 20 years to figure that out. And it's the same with calories, right? It's the same thing. And the funny part about this whole calories thing is that there's been so many studies, scientific studies, looking at calorie restricted diets. In fact, there is not even a single study that can prove, after 50 years of research, that eating a low calorie diet, like ignoring the foods, like the type of foods, and just looking at the number of calories, if you simply cut the number of calories, there's no evidence, there's no study that has ever been done that shows that it causes weight loss. So people say, "Oh, it's scientific. It's scientific." It's like it's not scientific. It's actually, there's not a single study that can prove. And look at the practical evidence. Like, okay, so if there's no study that shows it, what's the sort of experience of the people? Well, in fact, probably 98% of people have done a calorie restricted diet, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. When you make those substitutions based purely on the number of calories, it simply doesn't work for you. So that, anyway, that's why it takes so long, because any change to the prevailing sort of accepted wisdom just takes a lot longer than you would think. Even when in hindsight it looks super obvious, like, hey, avocados weren't that bad for you, olive oil wasn't that bad for you, fatty fish like salmon weren't that bad for you. It just takes a long time because the people who are in charge would rather blame somebody else for the failings rather than their own advice. So then it just stays for like decades and decades. And it's the same thing for the calories. You see all this people out there who, the minute you say that there's something more to it than the number of calories, you get this huge backlash from researchers, professors, all these stuff who had built their career on it's just the number of calories.
Let's stick on this calories thing a bit longer here and talk about the physiology. If somebody, say they're even on a healthy diet and they're eating, vegetables and good quality meats, but they decide to cut out, say, 300 calories a day, let's talk about how they're doomed no matter what and what the physiology does to compensate as they cut out those calories.
Yeah, and this is what we know for forever, right? So what happens is that people who talk about it's all about calories, they throw out this thing which they often say, "Oh, it's just the thermodynamics." Right? And it's funny how calorie people always talk about thermodynamics, but thermodynamics people never talk about calories. And they have this thing called the energy balance equation, which is fat, fat gain or fat loss, sort of body fat equals calories in minus calories out. And that's true that's always true because it's really, body fat is a storage, like it's a way to store calories, right? So calories in minus calories out. Just like if you have a box, right? The amount you put in minus the amount you put out is the change, right? It's no different than that. So body fat is just a way to store calories. So therefore, body fat equals calories in minus calories out, and that's fine. That's always true. However, what they do then is they take the additional step and say, therefore, if you simply reduce your calories in, you'll reduce your body fat. And that's not true. Because remember, there are three variables here. There's body fat, calories in, and calories out. When you reduce one variable, which is the calories in, there's two other possibilities. Either your body fat goes down, which is good, or your calories out, which is your metabolic rate goes down, right? Which is bad. But you can do one of those two things without breaking any laws of thermodynamics. If you look at the studies, so you reduce 300 calories, 500 calories a day, you can either lose 500 calories of body fat, or you can reduce your metabolic rate by 500 calories. Those are the two possible, and your body fat remains the same. Those are your two possibilities. Which one happens? Well, every single study from like the last 30 years, and there's been a lot of studies and there's been meta-analysis, and every single one shows you that when you simply, if you don't pay attention to the information, which is the types of foods that you're eating, if you simply just reduce calories, then what happens is that the metabolic rate goes down to compensate. So you eat 500 fewer calories, you burn 500 fewer calories because your metabolic rate goes down, and body fat stays the same. That's why you don't lose weight. But there's no breaking of any laws of thermodynamics or anything. So if you want to do that, if you want to simply lower your metabolic rate, then lowering your calorie intake is a great way to do that. But most of us don't want to do that. Most of us want to change the body fat percentage. And think of it this way: a lot of people are eating a lot of high calorie foods, right? So if you are taking 2,000 calories in, normally you're burning 2,000 calories, and your body fat is stable. If you go from 2,000 calories to 1,500 calories, well, then your body simply burns 1,500 calories and your body fat remains stable. Well, that's a perfectly scientifically valid, way of solving for those three variables, right? It's a balance equation. There's three variables, without causing any problems. And it all comes down to the fact that, hey, if you have 1,500 calories coming in and you want 2,000 calories to go out, well, then you need to make sure that the calories can come out of the body fat, right? Because that's your storage, right? So if you want stuff to come out of your storage compartment, you can't lock that box. Insulin, which is a hormone, it basically blocks you from taking calories out of body fat. That's its job. It's what it's supposed to do. So if you're eating foods, or if you're eating in a way, and this is like eating constantly is one way to keep your insulin levels high. If you're keeping your insulin levels high, you actually cannot access that body fat stores. So if your body fat percentage is locked while you reduce calories in, and body fat must stay stable because you haven't changed the hormones to let it change, then your only option, remember, three variables: calories in, calories out, body fat. You lock body fat into a constant. You reduce calories in, your only option is to reduce calories out. So that's, I mean, it's from a scientific mathematical standpoint, it's actually very, very obvious what needs to be done. You need to change the hormones, not the number of calories.
And we're going to get into all that and give people solutions here. But before we do, say somebody has gone by this calories in, calories out, and they've really been limiting their calories and having, minimal or no success. How long does it take for the physiology to reverse, or does it? Somebody might be saying, I've broken my physiology because I've been limiting calories for all these years doing these different diets. Does the body return to normal? And if so, how long does it take?
It actually only takes a few weeks. I mean, if you look at all the studies of metabolic rate, and this is the big thing that's important, is that people think that your metabolic rate is stable, right? If you burn 2,000 calories a day, you always burn 2,000 calories a day. That's not true. It is actually quite variable. It can go up or down. So if you reduce your calories, it's going to go, down. If it increase your calories, it tends to go up. The key is to how to keep that relatively stable while letting your body access the body fat. Because remember, the insulin is sort of the key to that, and you can start right away. But the thing is that your body fat as a store of calories, there's probably like 200,000 calories sitting there, right? So the key is, and say you take 2,000 in a day, and you have 200,000 sitting in body fat stores. The key is not the number of calories you're eating in that one day, right? Because you have 2,000 coming in, 2,000 going out, and 200,000 sitting in your body fat stores that you want to get rid of some of that. The key is not that few hundred calories you have coming in or going out. The key is, how are you going to unlock all of that fat? So, the point is that your body sort of exists in one of two states, right? If your insulin is high, you're storing calories. If your insulin is low, you're burning calories, right? So you're either in the fed state, storing calories, insulin high, or you're in the fasted state, which is, you know, insulin low, burning calories, pulling those calories back out. So you're either fed state or fasted state, insulin high or insulin low. The key, if you're wanting to get rid of some of that body fat, is to make sure you're spending a good proportion of your time in the fasted state, because that is the only time that you're actually going to be able to pull the calories back out from body fat. It doesn't work otherwise. And we know this because if you simply give somebody insulin, if you simply inject insulin constantly into people, and they've done these studies, then what happens is that people gain weight because you've given the body the instructions to gain weight. You've said gain weight, gain weight, gain weight. If you then take that person with 2,000 calories eating and you reduce it to 1,500, right? So you think you're going to lose weight, but at the same time, you keep injecting insulin into these people. And again, this study has been done. So you take 2,000 calories in, you go down to 1,700, but you're injecting a ton of insulin. Well, what happens? You gain over 6 months, people gain 20 pounds, even as they ate 300 calories a day less. How? The only way you can do that is to reduce your metabolic rate to like 1,400 calories a day, right? You reduce it lower such that your body continues to gain that body weight. Why? Because you gave your body the instructions to gain that body weight. So it all comes down to the sort of hormones, the insulin, and so on. And the question is, how are you going to do that? How are you going to affect those hormones? One is by the types of foods that you're eating. So remember, processed foods, especially processed carbohydrates, are probably the highest. So certain foods are going to be more fattening. Or two, affecting the amount of time that you spend eating in a day, right? That's the other way. So you have a longer period of fasting so that your insulin drops and you're pulling your body out, you're pulling those calories out.
We're going to get deep into the solutions, but before we do, I want to talk about a couple more areas just to get a full lay of the land for people. One being genetics and the other being exercise. So, since we're talking about calories and calories in, calories out, it would be neglectful for us not to at least address exercise and talk about its role in weight loss, if there even is one, and how that impacts calories and that whole system.
Yeah, the thing about exercise is that it's extremely good for you, but the weight loss is benefits are marginal. There is some benefit, but it's very small. And it's because it doesn't really affect the hormones that are important. Yes, it does in a sort of roundabout way because you're increasing the amount of calories that you're sort of using, but you're not really affecting the metabolic rate. So if you think about calories out, people think it's all about exercise, but it's not. If you think about basal metabolic rate, that's the amount of calories that you need to keep your heart pumping, to keep your lungs working, to keep your intestines and your liver and your brain, right? So this is just sort of every day you need a certain number of calories for energy. If you exercise, I'm not talking, about people who are exercising like 5 hours a day sort of thing, right? So if you do sort of mild to moderate exercise and if you've ever gone on one of those treadmills, you know how few calories comes out when you do a run or a walk. It's like 100 calories or 150, right? Again, I'm the people I treat tend to be like sort of 65, 75-year olds, right? I'm not talking about the 21-year-old sort of guy who's lifting 800 pounds deadlift sort of thing. I'm talking about a 70-year-old person who has type 2 diabetes. So you do some walking. You do some walking for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. That's, generally what we advise people to do. It's like 120 calories. So 120 calories out of your 2,000 calories that you're using for your brain and your liver and your percentage-wise is just not that much. So even if you increase, even if you double, you can go from 100 to 200 calories, you're still talking about less than 10% of your daily caloric expenditures. And you haven't made any changes because you think that exercise is going to make you lose weight. So therefore, you don't change the diet that gave you this weight gain in the first place, right? It's just a highly inefficient way to lose weight. So yes, there is some benefit, especially as you go into the higher levels of exercise, right? But for most people, it's just not a great way to do it. Which is not to say that you shouldn't exercise. You should 100% exercise because there's just a lot of other benefits that go along with it, right? It's sort of like brushing your teeth. It's good for you. You should do it every day, but don't expect to lose weight, right? So exercise is the same. It's good for you. You should do it. Makes you live longer, keeps your core strong, so you're going to fall less and all these sort of things. So it's especially important as you get older to do this exercise. So I'm not anti-exercise in any way. It's just that you'd have to be realistic about what it is that it's going to do. And weight loss is just not one of those things that it's going to be do. It because it's inefficient if you do a lot of it, like 6 hours a day, 4 hours a day. Yes, you will lose weight. It is certainly one of the things that you can do, but it's been over sort of exposed. And honestly, who doesn't know that exercise is good for you, right? It's probably like less than 1% of the population. Who doesn't think that they should be doing more exercise? Like 1% of the population, right? It's like everybody knows it. So what's the point of me harping about it? You should exercise, you should exercise. Everybody knows they should exercise. Like it goes without saying. So, as a strategy for weight loss, it's just almost irrelevant for in the cases that I'm talking about, right? So there are certainly people who can lose weight with exercise.
For somebody who is going to implement some of the solutions we get to later, changing the type of food we eat and when we're eating that food, can exercise be beneficial, or is this something you'd recommend to people trying to lose weight, doing the exercise while they're in a fasted state?
Yeah, so exercise in a fasted state is very effective. So if you don't eat for a while and then you exercise, then your body is in that state where it's already pulling energy out, right? It's using calories that are stored on your body. That's all it is. That's all that happens during fasting. If you now impose a certain amount of calories that you need extra for the run or the walk that you're doing, then it's going to keep pulling it from that. So that's good because you're simply making it more effective, the pulling out of the energy, which is losing the body fat. And sorry, I didn't answer that question about genetics that you had earlier. So genetics is very important. It actually plays a huge role in weight gain, and it's estimated that 70% of the sort of tendency towards obesity is actually genetic. And that makes sense because it's all about your hormones, and our hormones all respond differently. Yours are different than mine, mine are different than the next person. So everybody's genetics, everybody's hormonal responses are going to be different. That's why it's such an important thing. The you know if if weight gain was all about sort of conscious level control, that is what watching your diet and willpower and all that, of course, then genetics would play no role in weight gain, but it doesn't. It actually has a huge role. So when certain people are, and again, what it means is that certain people are going to be fatter or slimmer than others, which is true. I mean, we know this. Certain people just have a different body type. The point is, though, our genetics as a population have not changed in the last 50 years. So therefore, and as a world, like you can look at worldwide obesity, like the genetics of our planet have not changed in the last 1,000 years, really. So to blame genetics as the cause of the recent weight gain of the last 50 years, it's not right because it's not just a genetic problem. So, yes, genetics are important, but that's not what's changed in the last 50 years that led us to this obesity epidemic. So, we have to say, well, okay, so genetics is a big part of it, but that part hasn't changed. So, therefore, there's no point thinking about it. You can't change your genetics. So, what are you going to do about it? Like, you can't choose your parents. So, it's just sort of this dead end. And so we do all this research into the genetics, but it has no practical, implications for what I should do to lose weight, myself. I can't change any of that. So I generally spend no time thinking about, the genetics of obesity because it doesn't help that person, that patient in front of me. I can't change their genetics. So I actually spend no time thinking about it. Instead, I tend to focus on those things, which is the foods that you're eating and the amount of time you spend eating.
Well, let's get into that. Time to go deep into the solutions. And we've talked about insulin quite a bit, but let's get into the nuances here of how to control that, because I think this is going to be a brand new topic for a lot of people. Because again, all this information being filtered down about calories and low fat and all the nonsense that's keeping people obese and keeping people fat. So, for somebody who is totally new to this, you talked about before how we're either in a state where we're fed and insulin is high, or we're in a state where we're fasting or not eating for a period of time insulin drops, and that's when we go into a state where we can actually get to that fat that is locked up, that's on our body. So for
Yeah,
somebody
exactly.
who's brand new to this, let's talk about, we're going to get into both. We're going to get into qualities of foods and timing of food, but let's start with quality of food. What are people doing in that respect that's, causing that insulin to spike?
The main thing is processing of foods. Processed foods is much different. So the foods that you eat, if they're natural, our bodies have evolved to handle them. So, you eat a steak or you eat salad or you eat beans or whatever. Our bodies have developed, uh, controls on them. Because remember, body fat percentage is an incredibly important thing in the wild. So as you think about how humans evolved or any animals evolved, you never in the wild have really obese fish or really obese deer, because you'll die if you're overweight or obese. If you're an obese fish, for example, you are not going to catch any other fish because you're slower. On the other hand, other fish will eat you because you're slower. So the amount of body fat you carry, the percentage body fat, is extremely important. So your body has an incredible number of tight controls on that. If you're eating natural foods, so foods that are basically in their natural form, so stuff that you would see in nature, like, so if you eat a piece of meat, that is what you would get in nature. So a piece of meat. If you're to eat a vegetable, that's what you see in nature. When you start processing it, you sort of bypass all of the natural controls of it. So if you take wheat, for example, which is a natural food, but now you take the protein out, you take the fat out, you grind it into a powder, and now you have white flour. Well, that's not a natural product. You don't have flour coming out, on the side of the tree. So anything sort of packaged in a box, you've sort of started to play around, so you're actually not going to have those natural controls of how to eat. So when you eat natural foods, we have natural satiety mechanisms. So we'll stop eating at a certain point. When you eat processed foods, you're going to bypass that. So the point is that, the processing of foods is probably the single most important factor. Sugar also, of course, is another one of these factors that is not natural, added sugars. So if you take food and you add sugar to it, of course, then you're changing the way that it should be. Even if it's a meat, you add sauces that are very sweet, for example, then you've changed it because it's not simply that meat, it's a lot of sugar. So sugars, processed foods are probably the most important things in terms of the qualities of foods, and that's sort of it's not that controversial now. But you have to understand that in the 70s, the government, the U.S. government, had actually asked the processed food companies to create a whole new sort of generation of processed products. They thought processing was good because you could then strip out the fat. There's a whole bunch of unintended consequences of that, of course. And remember, the 70s is a time where we thought that we were simply so much smarter than nature. For example, with breast milk, we thought that formula was actually so much better for you than breast milk. So my mom always said I was raised on formula. And it's because only the poor people who couldn't afford it would ever give their kids breast milk. And if you're old enough, you'd remember that there was actually it took a huge campaign in the 90s called Breast is Best to convince mothers that, that breastfeeding was actually much better for you than bottle feeding, formula feeding. As ridiculous as that sounds now, because it sounds so intuitive now that yes, you should breastfeed unless you can't. But that was the sort of thinking at the time, was that processing was good. We can do better. We're smarter than nature, and therefore we are going to do better than nature. So therefore, processing foods to remove fat is good. So we took foods, we removed the fat, stuck in a whole bunch of sugar because, when you took out the fat, it tasted sort of nasty. So So this whole idea of the quality of foods comes down to sort of eating natural foods, trying to cut down the added sugars, and eating them in a sort of a natural way. And that's sort of where we are now. And it does. I don't think there's a whole lot of people who disagree with that. Focusing in on macros like protein versus carbs versus fat, or focusing purely on the calories misses the point, right? And that's another reason why the calories sort of argument is a purely artificial argument. You're looking at something, not whether this is a natural food or a unprocessed food. You're looking at number of calories. So you could say, hey, I can eat all this processed meat and processed carbohydrates as long as not more than 2,000 calories. It's okay. It doesn't work that way. So you look at places where they have a lot of obesity, like the certain states, the southern states actually particularly have a high level of obesity. If you look at the number of calories they eat, it's actually not a lot more than the average. The difference is that they're eating a lot of highly processed foods.
Well, I'll agree with you that I don't think anybody can really argue eliminating processed foods, eliminating sugars is going to be beneficial for a lot of reasons for all of us. But if somebody's tuning in right now and saying, okay, I've been on this health kick for a while and I've cut those out and I'm still not seeing the weight loss, like I'm not getting to my ideal body weight that I know I should be. I'm still maybe not obese, but I'm overweight. So let's talk about the macros and talk about for somebody, because I think it does depend too on where somebody is at along their health journey. Somebody who's in maintenance might be able to be a bit more liberal with their carbohydrates than somebody who is obese or overweight. And again, when we're talking about carbohydrates here, we're talking about things like sweet potatoes and whole foods. So let's talk about to that person, I should say, who has done a lot of the eliminating of sugars and processed foods, but they're still not losing the weight.
Yeah, so then you would look at the sort of the macros in terms of the carbohydrates, because there's a difference obviously in the way our bodies process them. So if you take sweet potatoes or potatoes and stuff, the insulin effect of that is going to be much higher than proteins and fats. So the starchy foods are just, remember, starches are chains of sugars. So anything that's starchy, so breads, rice, potatoes, that kind of thing, they're just going to elicit a very much higher insulin response. And so the idea simply is that you should reduce those starchy foods, even though they could be natural. And that's again not a new idea. I mean, the idea of reducing starchy foods was sort of accepted wisdom for the better part of the last 150 years. um, Cutting down some of the starches to lose weight is something that most people had sort of naturally already talked about. The the other thing is that the carbohydrates are not essential. That is, if you look at foods, proteins have amino acids, and there are a certain number of essential amino acids. That means if you don't get it, you're going to get sick. And there's a certain number of essential fatty acids. So if you don't get enough fats, you can get sick. There's no essential carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are really just a form of energy. So if you have a lot of energy, like body fat is a source of energy, then from a nutritional standpoint, you don't need any carbohydrates ever. So therefore, if you look at the foods, then you may want to cut down some of the starchy foods, because other than the processing, the added sugars, then the next step would be to say, well, we should probably sort of cut down the starchy foods. And then of course that only affect that that's only one part of the whole story, which is the diet. Of course, the diet is the foods that you eat. And I think that what is missing, of course, is that it's not just the foods that you eat, it's how often you eat them. Like, that was the part that nobody talked about and had actually changed a significant amount in the last 50 years. So instead of eating 3 meals a day, most people were eating sort of 7, 8 times a day and thinking that was healthy. But it's a huge change from previous. And it turns out that it may be just as important or more important than the diet. So there's the diet, which is the foods, and then there's how often you eat the foods. Because remember, that's what's going to change your balance between being in the fed state and being in the fasted state.
Well, we're going to get there, but we'll jump in now and we can maybe come back to food quality again in a bit. So let's talk about that because again, conventional wisdom that's passed down is like you talked about there, where it's advantageous to be snacking throughout the day to keep our metabolism elevated and keep us, you know, burning calories. So for somebody who this is paradigm shattering to hear this is not the way to do it, where do they start?
Well, you have to understand, first of all, that again, in the 70s, you're talking about 3 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, no snacks. By the time you get into the 2000s, you're mostly talking about people are eating 8 to 10 times a day. And they did it because people thought it was good for you to graze throughout the day. And one of the things that you always heard was that it keeps your metabolic rate stoked and all this kind of stuff. You're going to keep burning calories, right? You can't actually do that. When you eat, you're storing calories. You're not burning calories. You're telling your body, hey, food is coming in, store some of these calories, right? So you're pushing calories into the stores, which is body fat. So body fat is increasing every time you do this. You can't get around that. That's just the instructions you gave your body. If it's only when you don't eat that you have the instructions to use body fat, right? It's either store body fat or use body fat. You can't do both. You can't store it and use it at the same time because your body's just not that stupid. So this whole idea of eating more often is actually based on, again, zero science. There are zero studies that show that there's any kind of benefit to eating constantly. I mean, even if you were to think about it, you should eat constantly throughout the day to lose weight. Well, how is that going to happen? How are you going to lose weight by eating? Like, it's actually an impossibility. It doesn't work. And the thing is that if you eat small amounts throughout the day, one, you're not really listening to your body because you're not hungry anymore. You're just eating just because you're eating. But the other thing is that you think about the way we eat. If you eat a small portion of food, what is that going to do? Well, it's going to stimulate your appetite. That's what an appetizer is. It's a small portion of food that makes you hungrier, not less hungry, more hungry. So now, if you want to take an appetizer 10 times a day, but never actually eat enough to be full, you're going to stimulate your hunger and then stop yourself from eating every single time. And you think that's good. Why? Why would you think that's good? That makes no sense. We all have this sort of inertia. That is, when you eat, you want to eat until you're finished and then be done. That's it. You don't want to eat a little bit, make yourself hungry, then cranked up the willpower so that you stop eating. And then 2 hours later, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to, even though you're not hungry, you're going to stimulate your appetite. Now you've got the saliva flowing. You're thinking about food. You've got food in your mouth. Now you're going to crank up the willpower again and stop eating. Like, and remember, the instructions to your body to store calories as fat is coming in constantly. Instead of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you get instructions. Store those calories 3 times a day. Store the calories. The rest of the day, use the calories. Now you're giving your body the instructions to store those calories 10 times a day. It's like, how do you think you're going to lose body fat with that? It actually makes no sense and is based on zero science. But it just became one of these things that, and again, the history is very interesting because it developed from the low-fat diet. If you're eating, instead of sort of bacon and eggs in the morning, if you decide that to eat white bread and jam, because this is a low-fat breakfast, right? White bread and jam. Well, your insulin spikes up, your glucose spikes up, then it crashes. So by 10:30, you're ravenous. So then you go get a low-fat muffin. Insulin spikes up, glucose spikes up, then it crashes, and you're just ravenous at lunchtime. You can get a big plate of pasta or something. Insulin spikes up, glucose spikes up, then it crashes. At 2:30, you're ravenous again. So all of a sudden, you're eating 6, 8, 10 times a day, but where you never were because you're hungry all the time, but you think it's good because you're eating a low-fat meal. Now we know the low-fat diet really had no benefit whatsoever, and but the practice has changed from eating 3 meals a day to like 6, 8, 10 times a day. So it's breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack, and snack all the time. So you have no structure to your day. Your day is just one day of constant eating whenever you want. There's no structure to it. That is, you eat at breakfast, you don't eat outside breakfast. You eat at lunch, you don't eat outside lunch. You eat at dinner, you don't eat outside dinner. To one full day of, hey, eat whenever you want, wherever you want. And that's the thing. So that sort of all harkens back to the same dietary changes, but nobody pays attention to it. So that's sort of the is built on a sort of a lie, but then it gets perpetuated, it gets repeated. You repeat it often enough, and before you know it, people believe it with all their heart, even though, again, that's what science is supposed to do, is to test these things, but there's no science in that. It just sort of took a life of its own.
Well, what we're going to continue to do throughout the rest of our conversation here and throughout our whole conversation is hammer home the fact that when it comes to weight loss, the main hormone we're looking at here is insulin. So, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the physiology here. When somebody starts to change from eating the way you just described, where they're snacking all the time and continuing to spike glucose and insulin throughout the day, what about somebody who decides that it's time to make a change here and after dinner, I'm not going to have anything and I'm going to even skip breakfast and go all the way to lunch? So, I'm going to start doing a little bit of intermittent fasting here. Talk about the physiology of insulin as they do that and what happens in the body.
Yeah, so as you do that, so if you push the best, and what you're saying is really the best thing, is to sort of to push that those late night snacks and late night eating, sort of push them out, and try and finish eating earlier, and sort of eat breakfast a little later. That gives your body that sort of time it takes to lose weight. But what happens, of course, is that as your insulin starts to fall, then your body is going to start using up some of the calories it's stored. The insulin. There's also this thing called insulin resistance, which is if you're in a state where insulin is high all the time, your body develops insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance is winds up causing your body to make more insulin. So the longer you stay in that state, the worse off you are, right? And the body sort of reacts to insulin if it's not sort of up and down. So remember, hormones are supposed to go up and down, and that's the way that your body prevents resistance to those hormones. If your body is constantly exposed to highs, it will change so that it can accommodate those highs. If it's constantly low, it will also change. So that's just the natural physiology of things. So if you're in a very bright room, you're going to get accustomed to it. If you're in a very dark room, you're going to get accustomed to it. You go from dark room to light room, it's like, whoa. So the same thing. If you listen to music and you have very loud music, you actually start to go a little bit deaf, because your body is actually trying to protect your hearing by not hearing so much of it. So it develops resistance. Same thing with insulin. If insulin is always high and it's constantly high, then you're going to get resistance to it, and it actually makes the problem worse. Um, so the point is that you need to keep insulin in this sort of up and down mode rather than up and stay up, right? That's what you don't want to do. So when you're eating constantly, you're in this up and stay up all the time, right? You're eating foods that are very high in insulin, that is low fat, highly processed carbohydrates, high insulin foods, eating constantly, you're up high and staying high, which is how you get resistance, which then causes the insulin to go higher. So you're in this sort of vicious circle. If you get this sort of up and down. So you eat, it goes high, but then when you don't eat, it goes down. That's what you really want. And that's how all hormones are. So if you look at thyroid hormone, parathyroid hormone, cortisol, growth hormone, all of the hormones in our body are supposed to be pulsatile and not up and stay up. So that's the important thing. So if you want to get your insulin levels, if your problem is that you're high and all high, then you want to get it low. And that's the thing. So not only are you going to let it go low, but by keeping that pulsatility, you're going to prevent some of the insulin resistance, which causes your a lot of weight gain and stuff in the longer term. So it's an important topic. You're just trying to get back to that sort of natural um, flow, right? We're not supposed to be eating all the time. We're not supposed to be fasting all the time. There's supposed to be a balance in that, and that's why it's so important to have that fasting period every day. In fact, that's where you get the word breakfast, right? It's the meal that breaks your fast. You're supposed to be fasting. You're not supposed to be eating constantly. If you eat constantly and never fast, you can never break your fast. But that's not a natural state of how we're supposed to be living our life.
So to continue the story here, somebody decides to, not snack after dinner and skip breakfast. Their insulin drops. They start to unlock the fat that's stored on their body and use that for energy, which is likely what they want to do if they're overweight to get their weight down. How low does the insulin have to get before that unlocking happens? Does it go all the way down to zero, or is it just a certain threshold it has to hit?
Well, I mean, it's different for everybody. So it fluctuates up and down. If you have a lot of insulin resistance, then your insulin level may stay high. If you're taking insulin as a medication, it will never go to zero. In fact, insulin never goes to zero anyway, but there's a certain range. And really, what you're trying to do is sort of, if your weight is at a certain level and you're not happy with your weight, you want to lose some, then you want to change that so that you're sort of in a lower range. So even though insulin is, you can measure it and so on, it fluctuates a lot, so it's not that useful to measure it. It's more useful as a concept to understand what is happening in your body. But essentially, you just want to give your body the time it needs to use some of those calories. That's really all you're doing. There's nothing more complicated to it than that. Like if you want to use up body fat, then give yourself a break from eating. You got to take a break from eating in order so that you can use some of that body fat. It's a store of calories. You have too much, so you got to take a break and let your body use it. That's really all it is, as opposed to those people who are saying that you need to keep putting the calories in order to use it up. It's like it's actually not even possible to do that.
How sensitive is the insulin though? Like somebody who's brushing their teeth and maybe, swallowing a bit of toothpaste or chewing, say, a natural xylitol gum. Like, are these things throwing you out of your fasted state, or what does it take to actually
No,
consider
no.
to actually spike that insulin back up?
Yeah, the insulin is going to spike up. Certainly, with if any of those things can do it. Even thinking about food can put your insulin up, but the amount it goes up is minuscule compared to actually eating, like a slice of bread or something like that, right? So even though your insulin might go up a little bit, it's just going to keep going down right after you finish brushing your teeth or whatever. Or you finish about thinking about food or whatever. So yes, it's going to go up and down still, but overall, when you don't eat, you're going to see that trend of insulin go down. You have to focus on the big things, which is what you're eating, because that's just going to overwhelm the contribution of those other things.
So during the period when we are fasting, say it's in the evening and we've stopped dinner at 6 o'clock and we have that period of time before we go to bed that's significant. And then again in the morning, if we're not breaking our fast till noon, talk about things that we can consume during those periods of time and either have a neutral effect or things that can even enhance the fast if you consume them during those periods.
Yeah, the main thing is, just fluids like teas, green teas. So the coffee is fine as well. So they of course don't have any calories. They're not sweet, so they have a minimum insulin effect. Certain things like green teas are very beneficial just because they have other things. So, for example, caffeine is going to increase your metabolic rate a little bit. That's why people, it's a stimulant, right? That's why people drink it. So coffees and teas can have some benefit. Green tea in particular has these things called catechins, which are certain antioxidants. They've done a lot of research in Japan predominantly, where they do drink a lot of green tea. And there does seem to be a mild effect in terms of reducing appetite and also losing body weight. But the effect is relatively small. But on the other hand, it's a great thing to drink. I mean, it's healthy for you. Got antioxidants. There's no calories. You don't tend to put any cream or milk or sugar in it, so it's enjoyable just as a drink by itself. So that's generally what I recommend, is just taking these drinks if you have to. If you don't have to, you don't have to. The thing about breakfast too is that if you look at circadian rhythms of hunger, and you look at the period of time that people on average are the least hungry in the entire day, it's 8 in the morning. So that's just the way the body works. Before you wake up, there's a certain hormones go up, cortisol, growth hormone. And those actually are getting your body ready for the day ahead. And it already has told your body at 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. to start pulling some extra glucose out of the system, extra calories out of your stores, because you're going to wake up soon and you're going to need it. So everybody says, oh, you need to fuel up for the day ahead. Well, your body's already done that. Remember that you have 200,000 calories of sitting in your body fat stores. Your body's already given you the signal at 4 a.m. to start pulling a little extra out for the upcoming day. And you think you need to take an extra, 200, you need to put a muffin in your mouth, like 200 calories. It's like, well, now you're going to reverse that flow. You're going to you're going to, instead of be pulling calories out, you're actually going to be shoving them back into storage, because now you've overwhelmed that system. You're putting it back in. So it's like, you can eat breakfast if you want. I mean, certainly a lot of people in the 70s did so and maintained a stable weight. But if you're looking at trying to extend that fast, you know, because if you're not as hungry in the morning, it's going to be easier to extend that fast than late at night. But if you look at sort of the effect of which one is better for you, cutting out breakfast or cutting out dinner? Actually, cutting out dinner is actually just a lot more effective for weight loss. It's just not as easy to do in a sort of North American lifestyle. Like, it's a lot easier to skip breakfast every day than it is to skip dinner every day, because dinner has a lot of social implications. You eat dinner with your family, you eat dinner with friends. There's a lot more social implications. So it's much harder. But weight loss wise, it's actually probably better to skip dinner.
And it's easy enough if you're going to fast in the morning. If your family's having breakfast, you can have a coffee or a tea and still be part of that social experience. While at dinner, it's a little bit different. So, for somebody who is going to have a coffee or tea in the morning and they're curious about including things in there like MCT oil, butter, even cream, what are your thoughts on that and how that impacts insulin?
Again, it doesn't impact it much. So the pure fats don't impact insulin much. So the point is that, with the fats, and this is where some of the keto um, people were like, oh, you should eat a lot of fat. You should put extra fat in there. It's like, well, ketosis is a state where you're burning body fat. So your body is using fat as a source of energy. But if you're putting in fat and burning it at the same time, you're not going to affect the level, right? So if you're so the point is that you really want to be burning your endogenous fat. If you add fat in on the other side, it's just going to limit the amount that the amount that it's going to go down. So you can put a little bit of cream if you want. That's not going to make a huge difference. If you start putting in huge amounts of butter and MCT oil, well, you're still going to burn fat, but you've put in fat too, so you're going to negate it. Now, if you like it and you're getting good results, you may wind up better. So say, and this was the thing with bulletproof coffee. People put in MCT oil and stuff, but then it made them full and they didn't want to eat until dinner. So overall, like when you look at the net benefit, yes, they're doing better by putting in that extra little bit and then fasting for longer. So it can work. I mean, there's no reason if it's working for you, not to do it. But on the other hand, if for most people, you're better off taking less of that because you want your body to use the stores that it has.
That makes sense. And one thing I hadn't heard of and I found fascinating in your book is talking about stevia. And people often know that this doesn't spike glucose, but glucose is different than insulin. Often they go hand in hand, but in the case of stevia, there is an insulin spike. I'd love for you to talk about this. So it's affecting
Yeah,
the insulin, but not the glucose.
yeah, the glucose, because of course it doesn't have glucose, but insulin is a nutrient sensor, so it's anticipating when you're eating. So if you have that sweetness, then it goes up. In fact, some of the sweeteners it goes up quite a bit. So therefore, it can make things worse. I mean, not everybody, of course. So there's this thing about sweeteners. um, there's this huge debate about artificial sweeteners. And, to me, it always seems kind of silly. If it works, if just taking artificial sweetener works, then you're eating fewer calories, right? You're getting less sugar, you're getting less calories. Then it's not a secret. Like, this stuff is not like you can't get this stuff or it's expensive. Like, anybody can get Diet Coke, right? So if it worked, it would have worked already. Like, we would have all simply switched to diet everything and dropped 50 pounds. Like, when was the last time somebody said, oh yeah, I just switched from Coke to Diet Coke, lost 20 pounds? Like, it literally never happens. Like, I've spoken to a lot of people who have tried to lose weight. Virtually zero of them have been successful just switching to low calorie, whatever, low calorie cookies, low calorie, like, because you can get all kinds. And they've been around for, since what, the 60s? So it's no secret. So if it worked, it would have worked already. We would have heard about it. Some of our friends would have been like, yeah, I did that and it worked great for me. But it's something that you really just never hear about. So therefore, the bottom line from a practical standpoint is that it doesn't really work. You think it works, you think it should work, but it doesn't. So if you enjoy sort of these low calorie drinks and so on, it's fine. But there's a hidden side to it, of course, which is that if you take something very sweet, you may very well stimulate your appetite and therefore want to eat. And that's going to make you, you know, that's going to work against you. So it's far more common for me, just from a pure practical standpoint, from my experience, it's far more common for me to hear that, hey, I switched out my diet sodas and I dropped 20 pounds, compared to I switched to diet soda and dropped 20 pounds. That almost never happens. Whereas once in a while, you find a person who's drinking sort of 10 Diet Cokes a day and not understanding why they can't stop eating. It's like, well, it's because you're drinking all this stuff, it's sweet, your body is now craving sweets that you haven't given it, and now you want to go get a cookie because of the sweetness, and you're already thinking about it and so on, right? So the diet sodas can the sweeteners can stimulate insulin, even though it doesn't stimulate glucose. It can stimulate appetite, right? So it doesn't have sugar and it doesn't have calories, but again, you're only focused on a very narrow slice of what it can do to your body. You're not taking into account the hormones, the insulin, the sort of the appetite stimulating effect, the sweetness, that kind of thing.
And I think it's important to highlight too, while we're talking about this and getting into diet soda, that there is such a continuum too when it comes to these sweeteners like aspartame or whatever they're putting in diet soda versus stevia or monk fruit, things that people that are in the natural health world may use to sweeten their coffee or tea in the morning.
Yeah, there certainly is a difference, and it's not an easy thing to answer sometimes because everybody also reacts to these differently. So there's plenty of people who can drink diet sodas without any problems and without, and in that case, that's great. But there's also plenty of problems, plenty of people who have problems and therefore should consider cutting them out. Right? It's an important sort of caveat. It's one of these mistakes that some people wind up making without realizing they're making it. That is, they're like, oh, my calories are down. I'm just drinking 10 sodas a day, but they're all diet, so it's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay. That might be your problem. And if you drink one a week, that might be okay, but 10 a day might not be okay. I actually see a lot of people who do wind up, not so much now because I think it's a little less common, but certainly a few years ago, I used to see a lot of people, and you'd ask them about it, and they're like, "Yeah, 4 or 5 a day is what they're drinking."
While we're talking about the fasted state, let's get into the role of ketones. How long does it take to be in a fasted state? And I know this is going to be different depending on the person. There's individual variability here, but in a general sense, how long till somebody gets into ketosis or starts making ketones, and how does that impact the whole equation here?
Ketosis is this thing. It's a natural state when you don't eat or you don't have carbohydrates. So remember, your body sort of stores energy in two ways. You can store it as glucose or it can store it as fat. Once you get through the glucose, you then burn fat and then you generate ketones. Because the ketones cross the blood-brain border and then they feed the brain. So you don't have to fast to get ketosis. You can eat an extremely low carbohydrate diet. That's the ketogenic diet, of course, which became popular a few years ago. Essentially, what it means is that your body is in a state where it's just burning fat. It's not burning glucose, right? So two types of fuel, glucose or fat. If you're purely in the fat range, you're going to start getting ketones. So you could actually, some people say, how long does it take to fast to get into? You don't even have to fast. You can get into ketosis just by following a ketogenic diet. It just means that you're in a fat burning state. It doesn't mean that you're losing fat, though, because if you're adding fat and burning fat, you're not going to affect the amount of fat. You can actually add a lot of body fat, not burn as much, and actually gain body fat while in ketosis. So it doesn't immediately mean that you're going to lose it. It just means that your body is using fat as a fuel. If you are a standard sort of American with eating a relatively high carbohydrate diet, remember the advice for decades was sort of 50 to 60% carbohydrates. Then your stores of of sugar are relatively full, and therefore it's going to take about sort of 18 to 20 hours, 24 hours of fasting before you get into ketosis because you can store enough glucose to last that. Now, because a lot of people have never fasted 24 hours, they're almost constantly in a state where they're using glucose. Again, doesn't mean that you have excess body fat stores. It just means you're using glucose and not you're using fat. So certainly a lot of people never go into ketosis and maintain a normal weight. A lot of athletes never go into ketosis and maintain a normal weight. So that's all it means. A ketogenic diet is actually quite interesting because it's a way for people to sort of stay in that very low carbohydrate range, and that's why the difference with the ketogenic diet and the previous sort of iterations of low carb diets was that people were very afraid of the fat, and therefore with the ketogenic diet they're trying to replace the carbohydrate calories sort of with fat calories as opposed to protein necessarily. So it became very popular because it sort of followed a lot of the science that these fats were not actually bad for us.
And Jason, do you follow a specific diet? And I'm curious when it comes to fasting, what's a typical day look like for you?
I don't follow. I'm sort of low carb, not fully. I'm not like super low carb. I tend to not be too rigorous about the diet because there's many different diets that can work. Like if you look around the world, so if you go back again to the 70s, because that's a time when there's just not a lot of obesity, you have places in the world that are eating a lot of rice, like Asia, for example. You have places that are eating a lot of potatoes, perhaps in Ireland or something like that. And you have places that are eating a lot of fish. And, every cuisine has sort of different emphasis, and they all did well. The key was that they weren't eating all the time is the main key, and two, they weren't eating a lot of sugar. Once you introduce a lot of sugar and processing into the diet, that's where things go wrong. So really, I try not to be too um, strict on the macros so much, but really strict on the sugar and not eating all the time. And that's sort of the main thing. So I will eat sort of all different foods, but I try to eat as natural as I can, and also I try to avoid the carbohydrates because carbohydrates in North America tends to be relatively refined. So that's the main thing that I try to watch out for in terms of the diet. And it's the same thing I wrote in the obesity code, right? The 1 and 2 is like, eat natural foods and cut down the sugar. That's probably the two most important things. And then don't eat all the time. Carbohydrates, yes, they do play a role, but they tend to play probably not as big a role. So therefore, even though I try not to eat as much I eat far less carbohydrate than I used to. For example, it's not something that I will just completely cut out for whatever reason. So a typical day is sort of like I don't eat breakfast. Like I don't eat breakfast most days, honestly. And that was never just because I was trying to lose weight. It's mostly because I like to sleep more than I like to get up and eat, and I'm not that hungry. So why would I eat when I'm not hungry? It makes no sense to me. And then I try to not snack during the day, and then I'll eat lunch and dinner, or many times I'll do something at lunch. I'll work through lunch instead, and then therefore I'll just eat dinner. And that's about it. And that gives me a little bit more flexibility in terms of the foods that I can eat. And then once in a while, especially when I've gone on holidays or something, I might do a little bit longer fasting. So again, it just allows me more flexibility to eat different foods, which I enjoy.
For somebody who decides they want to have not a cheat meal, but a higher carbohydrate meal during their eating window, say they're going to a birthday party, having a piece of gluten free cake and maybe some sushi, so they're having a lot of rice. Are there certain adjuncts that you'll use or that you could recommend to people to help, level off? You're still going to obviously have that insulin spike, but is there certain things that we can take, either supplements or certain foods we can add into that mix that'll help nullify that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's generally not supplements, but the two things, one is fiber. So if you are eating foods that contain carbohydrate, you'll see that in nature, virtually all carbohydrate containing foods also contain fiber, and the fiber is going to sort of dull that spike a little bit. And then the other thing is acidity, like vinegar. Vinegar is one of these things that, and it probably slows it down because the vinegar may slow down digestion a little bit. So, and gastric emptying and so on. So, remember the food when you eat, you don't absorb all of it right away. It goes into your stomach, and your stomach holds it, and then sort of pushes it out a little bit at a time for you to digest it. That's why when you stop eating, you're still in the fed state because your body still has this big reservoir of whatever you've eaten. It just sort of just slowly pushes it out. If you slow down the rate at which it pushes it out, then you're going to absorb it much more slowly over that time. And vinegar is one way to do it. So vinegar is acetic acid, but lactic acid, which is fermented foods, also may be useful. So certain cultures, for example, use vinegar very heavily for that. So kimchi, for example, is a fermented food, so not vinegar but lactic acid. And sushi rice, which you mentioned, is vinegared rice. Now people add sugar to it, stuff, but the vinegar and people have looked at the sort of insulin spikes and glucose spikes. It tends to be a lot less when you eat the sushi rice, just because the vinegar probably means that it doesn't come out so quickly from the stomach. It probably slows down the overall GI motility a little bit. So those are things that you might be able to do just to sort of hold the line a little bit.
Yeah, some great ideas. And one thing I want to address before we part ways is a special population, which is a type 2 diabetic. So somebody is in this position, they're taking insulin, they're injecting themselves on a regular basis, on a daily basis. They're probably listening right now and going, I feel kind of screwed because, like, I'm learning here insulin is the problem, and this is something I'm injecting into myself on a daily basis, maybe causing insulin resistance and feeding into that loop you discussed before. So for somebody like that, that's like, okay, I'm ready to make changes and I want to, potentially even get off of this insulin. What would you say to them? Because it seems like that way of handling is a major band-aid. It's actually just stoking the fire and continuing this cycle of insulin just being haywire.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the way that we treated type 2 diabetes in the past was mostly just a band-aid solution. That is, if you think about type 2 diabetes, the way you have to think about it is that your body really just has too much glucose. So if you fill up your body full of glucose and then you put more glucose in, right? So you're eating more sugar, more carbohydrates. Well, it's just going to spill out. It spills out into your blood. So your blood glucose is too high. But that's because your body is already full of it. If you take something like insulin, it doesn't get rid of the glucose from your body. It simply takes that glucose and just shovels more of it into storage. So it's just like if you blow up a balloon, like you can put more air in, but it just gets harder and harder to do so. So it takes more and more force. So then at some point, your body can't do it and you give exogenous insulin. So you're actually not making the problem better, you're making it worse. So the idea is that, if you simply empty out your body of some of that glucose, not just the blood, but your whole body, then you're going to be able to reverse that type 2 diabetes. So, but you can't do it just by using medication. What you have to do is change your diet, and that is low carbohydrate diets have been shown to reverse type 2 diabetes, and intermittent fasting is another way. If you don't eat, your body will use up some of that glucose. That's it. And then you can take less medication. It's really just as simple as that. And the problem is, of course, that type 2 diabetes is a largely dietary disease. So you need to fix the diet. You can't use drugs for a dietary disease and hope to do well. Certain drugs are useful, and there's nuances as to what you should use and shouldn't use, but in general, it's all going to come down to the diet because that's the root cause. That is, the diet is your root cause. You need to fix the root cause, not trying to apply another medication. You can't keep the same diet and take this drug and hope that you're going to get better because you never fix the actual issue in the first place, right? It's looking at that, what is causing it, and then trying to fix it, as opposed to just trying to patch over the solution, right? It's a band-aid on a bullet hole. The problem is that you've got all these underlying issues, and you're just trying to cover it up. Like, you can't do that, but that's what we've done. So if you get down to the sort of dietary issues that caused it in the first place and you fix those, then you can actually reverse the disease.
And how often is injectable insulin being prescribed to type 2 diabetics these days? Is it something that's, being toned down, or is it still like, is it just for certain people that get to a really extreme point with their diabetes, or how often is it used?
It's a standard medication. So usually you use tablets first, and then when you get to a certain point, then insulin is usually given. The problem is that most people haven't focused on the diet so much. So certain companies, so there's a company at United Health called Level 2 that I work with, and they're trying to put the focus squarely back on the diet and really focusing people. So if you look at the way type 2 diabetes should be treated, it should be diet, 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 then drugs. When you go to see your doctor, the way they treat it is drugs, number one, and no talk about the diet. So that's the problem. Even though we know we should be talking diet, 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 it's all drugs, drugs, drugs in the real world, like when you actually see your doctor. So that's what level 2 is trying to do. It works with your insurance and stuff to really put the focus back on the diet, and maybe you don't need the drugs, right? It's trying to write that sort of you know we sort of took so many shortcuts. We're just trying to put it back and make sure that we're on the right track again.
Well, the beautiful thing about this conversation is I'm sure it gives a lot of people hope. We're not saying like you've abused your body till this point following, unfortunately, a lot of what's been touted from doctors and dietitians and such. Again, we're not blaming them. It's the way they were educated and what they're passing down. But there's a lot of hope with this message. People can make changes, they can heal their body, they can lose the weight. So I just think this message you're sharing through your books and through our conversation here is just so important. And I hope it can spread far and wide. And we're going to link everything up. We're going to link the books up in the show notes, Jason. We're going to link up your social media. And I just want to thank you for coming back on the show.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse. Great to be here.